But we can have a cemetery that can be paid for by the money that goes towards purchasing the land. I mean, it's buy one, get one, right? You can pay 200 grand and have a cemetery. In no fields, you can pay 200 grand and have a cemetery and fields. And, you know, a lot of talk during the sequestration about kicking the can down the road. You know, we're going to kick the field question down the road, and, you know, 10 years from now, maybe 5 years from now, maybe 2 years from now, we're going to want fields. And it's going to cost us $1 million at that point. And, you know, the demographics of the town are changing. Maybe that warrant article passes. So I think we're much better served with bird in hand that we know is going to suit everybody's needs.
Any other comments?
I guess the question on that was, does no mean no impact the ability to continue to put forest view on the ballot as something to be funded? Anybody else?
Well, I will say, and I don't think that there's any disagreement that the town has to have a cemetery, right? And so, you know, whether it's a warrant article to, you know, build forest lawn or whether it's a field, right, the town has to have it. And so I believe it's the selectmen's responsibility if it were to turn out that we weren't to have a place to bury people in Amherst, we would have to figure out how to get that done. We'd have to look within the town budget. I mean, it might not be the current plans that are on the table. So there isn't the option to say no forever. But I think that, you know, as a couple of people have pointed out, at least there's the responsibility to go and to put the plan in front of the voters rather than to try to backdoor it by taking maintenance funds, using it to build a new cemetery, and letting the taxpayers just pick up the difference.
Just to add, and I think it's important to note because the cemetery trustees aren't up here, but to me the crux of the issue is, can cemeteries and rec coexist without diminishing the cemetery? Because you can argue that the town needs fields and it will cost a lot more money to build fields, for sure. You can also argue, though, that the cemetery trustees, although they're townsfolk and taxpayers, acting fiduciarily as cemetery trustees, that's not their concern. You can argue that. You may not argue that, but you could. So if you take that tack, which is, look, these guys fiduciarily have to look out for cemeteries only and they have to put their blinders on. If you take that tack. The crux of the question is, as cemetery trustees, you want your cemeteries to be built. So you definitely would want to sell off excess assets for money to build your cemetery. So that would make sense even for the cemetery trustees to sell off floodplain land, get money, and build cemeteries. They get their cemeteries. There's a challenge to get that money otherwise. So again, the question becomes, as a cemetery trustee, is can those two coexist and still have healthy cemeteries? I mean, that's really the answer that the three of them have to struggle with. To date, the answer has been strongly no. We feel that those two coexisting diminishes the cemetery and our fiduciary duty looking after the cemetery trustees. And that's been the problem. That's been the frustration when I mean, we're all friends here, we're all volunteers, but when the selectmen and the cemetery trustees have gotten together, we've agreed on a lot of things. We've all served the town for many, many years. We all want to do the right thing. The crux of the disagreement is that question.
This gentleman's been waiting. Sorry.
Excuse me.
I think it's been a great discussion, and I hope it continues. I've got a couple of comments and then a question. As to the comments, if there was a win-win, I'd love to find it. But I'm not sure, in my experience, having tramped around those fields for 20 years, that it is a win-win for the taxpayer to take the floodplain part of the land and allow the good cemetery land to be used for cemeteries, because there's a reason why the fields are where they are, after all. I was down there with my dog during the years that dogs were allowed down there while my kids were playing sports, and the dog would like to go to the back park. And luckily I had my boots on, because a lot of times while the playing fields were fine, if you were in the back park, you couldn't be playing a soccer game there. You couldn't be playing anything there unless you were playing with your dog in the mud, because that's what was there. So, you know, there's a practical issue there, I think. I'm not an engineer. Engineers can certainly tell us as to how big a problem that is. But it dovetails into my second comment, and that is really, if what you're buying is floodplain land that really does flood after all, then when you bring the appraiser in, how much is that land really going to be worth? Is that really going to solve the problem for the cemetery trustees, even if it does leave the taxpayers with land that isn't suitable for the purpose that they want it to be used for? So there's my comments. I don't think it solves anything, but maybe adds to the discussion a little bit. But my question is this. I'm wondering, from time to time, I pay attention to what the Board of Selectmen is doing, but I can't say I've paid strict attention over the last 20 years. I'm wondering whether the board has ever considered doing an eminent domain and taking the cemetery fields by force.
Well, there's kind of three questions, so I think two are easy. One, the first one is that the floodplain land is actually good for fields, believe it or not. Because when we say floodplain, I don't know if it's a 100-year flood or 50 or 100 year.
Yeah.
So what it is, it's roughly on average one time per year, every 100 years it floods. So as far as fields go, that's actually a very good thing. Now that year, or even mild flood years, for those days, you can't play, for sure. But actually for the fields, it's actually very healthy and very good. There's fields that are on another road, they're in a floodplain, and it's extremely lush, healthy grass. So as far as fields, it's perfect for fields, actually, ironically.
Well, when they're dry.
Right, well, right, when they're dry, but they're not actually flooded or wet that often for floodplains. But in a general sense, it's actually a positive thing as long as they stay dry for most of the season. On the value side, we certainly haven't had it appraised, but we have sort of tangential appraisals. And our belief is that enough money would be generated by the value of even a floodplain, the amount of acreage that's back there, to, if not pay for the entire Phase 1 cemetery field, a significant part of it. And then there's other ways, partnerships, to get additional revenue, which would be a small amount, to actually build Phase 1 of the cemetery. On the eminent domain side, I really don't have comments other than Dwight said it. Let's not forget we have an obligation to have cemeteries. So I think eminent domain is the public good. I'm not sure the public good is served by taking the land so that there are no cemeteries. So
It wouldn't result in there being no cemeteries, though. It's an extension of the idea of the land swap that is difficult. But what it does is it forces the hands of the cemetery trustees to say, this land is no longer yours, but here's the fair value of the land, and your obligation now is to go buy other land.
Right. No, interesting. I haven't heard that before, but I don't. Interesting.
We'll keep that in your advisement.
Okay.
Nancy, you haven't had a chance to speak. Is there anything that you'd like to jump in at this point?
No, I think it has been clear that there is a need for both playing fields and a cemetery. And, it's the Recreation Commission's hope that a compromise can be made so that, so that we can meet both needs of the Amherst community. My hope would be that if it's not settled by September 1st of 14, that we might be able to reach some type of a short-term agreement where we could continue to use the fields until it has been settled one way or the other.
Just to interrupt that, I know even if the cemetery trustees wanted to do that, which I don't know if they do or don't, we cannot do that. That's the problem. That you would be breaking the law and you would have a court issue and you would definitely have challenges if you were to do that.
So as of September 1st, if it's not settled by then, we will have a definite, I don't want to say crisis, but we'll have a challenge in terms of meeting field demand in terms of the space that we have available. It will be less in the fall, but the spring of 2015 is when we will really feel the impact.
You have a question? Comment?
Patrick Daniel, thanks for everyone for the opportunity to talk about this tonight and for the cemetery trustees that are here. The shared space, I think, is a simple solution. It sounds like sense. Part of the, I love vision pictures, if you will, so I'm trying to close my eyes and vision kids running around in a soccer field and a cemetery. To my knowledge, from the previous discussions, I believe the space, the land towards where you first enter would be where the cemetery plot would be and would need to be elevated, correct, in terms of putting in a certain amount, and then the lower portion, obviously, and I'm trying to envision in terms of the, would it be a 30-foot, a 40, do we know how much fill would need to be brought in there in terms of making that suitable for cemeteries, if you will? And the thought again as well is I don't know how much effort's been put into maybe coming up with some sort of a design, and maybe putting the cart before the horse here a little bit, but, could we do something where they live together where you have two separate, access points, if you will, in terms of the driveway into a cemetery and have a separate one into the playing fields. And the win-win obviously here is obviously the cost, which was brought up earlier in terms of the selling of the plot lands. But I also think in terms of some of the issues that come up with cemeteries in terms of, and one of the things I was reading in some of the trustees' notes recently, they're online, is that they've had issues with vandalism and concerns there. And so I think if, a cemetery that lives next to a playing field, you're going to have less issues with vandalism as well. So I think there's a lot of factors here that, that both can reside and live next to each other, if you will. If you build the cemetery up high, maybe in the winter, and the town I used to live in, the cemetery was our sledding hill in the winter. So, if it's up high enough, maybe you have a safer place to go tobogganing as well. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here, if you will. And I think if people are open to that. So I don't know if there's been a thought there in terms of the design or how much, because we've been so focused in terms of trying to be open to that. But anyway, I just wanted to add that in terms of, thank you.
Thank you. Let me just comment and sort of go back to what Brad said. I do a fair amount of development of land developments and so on. Can you divide 47 acres so that two uses can coexist? Absolutely. You can create barriers, berms, whatever you want to do, right? There's a lot of easily movable dirt there. You got to remember that land actually was a hill back before the cemetery, way back. And it was a gravel pit. It was, they took all the gravel out. So it can be sculpted to do whatever you want. The crux of the question still comes back to what Brad said. If the landowner, which is the cemetery trustees or the trust, and those trustees decide that the two uses are not, should not be done together on that parcel, then forget about the design. That's the decision, so.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've, again, the boards are amicable, we've known each other for many, many years. We've gone down the road exactly that. Let us pay for designs, we'll give you a good design to show to coexist, but the problem is that the people who control the land think that that is diminishing their fiduciary duties as cemetery stewards. So we certainly weren't going to pay for design and come up with creative ideas when there was, it was a non-starter, or it hasn't been a non-starter to date.
I wanted to talk a little bit about demand. I mean, we're talking, if one were to go down to the DPW and count the open grave spots on the maps down there, you're going to find it's over 600 unsold graves in the current cemetery in the village. So, I mean, that to me says there's no immediate demand for a cemetery. At what point do we undertake a new cemetery? I mean, we've got capacity for 30, 40, 50 years in the current cemetery. There's no big rush here on this. The only rush is an artificially imposed rush by the court settlement, which, it's important to point out that that's a settlement. It's not a judgment made by a judge. It's an agreement reached by the attorneys and then agreed to by the other parties involved. So I think that, what's that?
What are you referring to?
The court settlement in 98 or 99?
The agreement?
The agreement, right, yeah. I mean, if the judge had ruled on it, that's one thing, but having the attorneys agree to it and then get the parties involved to sign off on it's different. And that can be amended very easily. In fact, an agreement to sell the land would basically render that court settlement null and void at that point. It would no longer be a barrier. So, I mean, I'm concerned about, the fact that we do have adequate cemetery space for the foreseeable future, and that only lends more credence to the argument to find shared use for this land, to find a compromise solution.
So we've been going for an hour and 10 minutes now. Does anyone comments?
Lacey Eastland, I just have a quick question. Brad, you had said at the beginning, following on Andy, what you just said, that going back to the courts is a non-issue. The town is not going to go back to the courts to have the agreement amended or the settlement amended.
Yeah,
Why is that?
our impression and our legal advice, and also I think the cemetery trustees would certainly agree, is that there's always a possibility after some amount of expense and some amount of time that you get the courts to amend it. The problem is the parties that were on the other side for the agreement in the first place are quite active and quite vocal that they will challenge that if you try to extend it. So our impression is best case scenario is it's going to be years in the court if you even are victorious at the end, and by that point you spent money and you've had so much time go by you didn't really accomplish anything.
Okay. So the second question I have is then what can we do? Because it sounds like we're at a stalemate. We got 3 people who are doing what they think is best for the town. How do we put this even to a vote? We're letting their judgment of what they think is peaceful, I want to say coexistence, but it's not. It's non-existence of shared space. They think there's no possibility for shared space, but you can look all over the state. We've been at lacrosse tournaments and lacrosse games where we're playing lacrosse and 100 feet down the slope is a cemetery. I mean, there's pictures of it. We've seen it around the state. Obviously, other people in New Hampshire have figured it out. I would think Amherst could too. So we're letting 3 people say it's impossible. Amherst cannot do that. So as a town, I mean, it's great we're having this meeting, but it's just kind of tilting in a windmill, it sounds like. What can we do of a town of 30 or 40,000? How many people live in Amherst?
12.
10? What is it? I don't know.
10.
10, 11.
I'll see you 15.
Hey, it took me a year to find my house from the dump. So, what do we do?
Well, actually, Lisa, there is an instrument in the trustee handbook. There is an RSA that provides an instrument that would allow the voters to have a say in this. Recently, we did submit a warrant article or a petition for a warrant article that would allow this to come up in the next election. Now, unfortunately, the way this is structured is that the warrant article is to remove the trustees and replace them with selectmen who will act as the trustees until such time as the town votes again. So I think you've got to take the people out of the issue and sort of focus on the fact that this is providing a mechanism for the voters to have a say in a very important decision that affects the town today and tomorrow. I mean, we're a community of 4 and 5 bedroom homes, right? Who's going to buy those homes? I mean, there's not enough spinsters out there with sisters to buy these. It's going to be families are going to buy these. Like families are going to move to town. We need infrastructure. I grew up in Amherst, and I used to ride my bike to my grandparents' house in Mason. I used to ride in Mount Vernon and Milford. Same roads we have today, but now there's about 50 times more cars on these same roads. I wouldn't let my kids ride from my house on Ravine Road to the village alone. So it's a different world we live in. It's a different world we're raising children in, and that requires areas where the children can go, whether it's playgrounds, whether it's playing fields, structured environments where they can have structured activities. So, the warrant article will be on the ballot, and I would encourage everybody to get out and vote. I mean, this issue will ultimately be resolved as it should be democratically at the polls. So, tell everybody. We've got a dismal voting record in this town. We have very, very little turnout, and people need to come out and they need to vote.
Okay. All right, thanks, Sean.
Sure.
I'm not tired of talking about this yet.
I'm
I've
tired
got a
of
babysitter till 10, so.
What's that?
I've got a babysitter till 10, so.
Oh, I've got plenty of time. I'm Tyler Lawrence. I've been in town for, I don't know, since about 97 or so. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to clarify, just for my own understanding and in terms of the people that would like to understand. Is the trust, i.e. the trustees, legally allowed to sell any portion of the plot of land called cemetery field? Could they legally do that if they decided, hey, we should sell?
Yes.
They can sell a piece of it. So behind it all is this idea that someone within the, is there someone they represent within the trust that feels that this use is not appropriate as a side-by-side use, or is it precedent, or what is it that seems to dictate that that's a non-starter?
The opinions of the trustees, is there?
Solely.
So, yeah, the trust, the cemetery trustees can legally sell assets. By the way, it's not common that a cemetery trustee would own land. That's not the normal way to do it. It just was an opportunistic thing that happened. So they're in a little bit of an awkward position to even represent this. They have to be, the one thing they have to be careful is they cannot diminish the value of any asset, cash or otherwise, in the trust. So they can sell the land, but they have to make sure that whatever they sell it for equals or increases the value of the trust. That's the one thing that they have to be very careful about.
So then is it true then that we now understand that the land that they purchased for a cemetery is, they once thought was suitable, is not actually suitable? Is that correct? Or
No.
did they know that all along? That was
Yeah,
known all along?
It's a huge piece of land. So
How many acres?
it's 47 acres.
47
If all of that was suitable, you would literally have thousands of years of
Right.
cemeteries. They did not go in and say, hey, we got a swamp. The amount that's suitable is actually very large, and it was a very good deal at the time. It was a wise decision for the town. So that's not a surprise. And it's still a suitable piece of land for 3 phases or 4 phases of cemeteries. And that back 60% was always not suitable for, as far as I knew, for cemetery.
So what is the ongoing financial struggle that seems to keep passing the town this bill? Is this based on their need to build this because they're required to do it from the settlement, or?
No, they're not required. The settlement is,
Sorry, I didn't interrupt you, but Andy kept mentioning this, and it's come up in other meetings, but there's this supply and demand thing, which leaves me scratching my head, where we don't actually have a need to build a cemetery for quite a long time, based on the rates that I've heard. But what is driving the requirement?
well, they're different issues, because whether you need a cemetery now or you don't, it doesn't matter as far as the issue, which is September 1st. Because September 1st court date has nothing to do with building a cemetery or not. All it has to do with is you cannot do rec on the land. So even if you don't need a cemetery, or even if we conserve money and don't build a cemetery for 15 years, we still don't have fields anymore. So they're different issues. One is, when do you want to build a cemetery? And one is, can rec continue? And this decision doesn't drive this decision.
So unless the trustees sell a piece of it or change their minds, it doesn't sound like it.
Right? They have to break the title. They can't own it. They have to subdivide a parcel and break the title. That's the only way to not have to go to court, which is,
Or sell the whole thing.
well, yeah, they have to break the title one way or the other. Selling the whole, yeah, exactly.
Can they lease it? Can they not lease it?
You can't have, without going back to court, you cannot have recreation on that land after September 1st. Because of a court order that's beyond them, beyond us, other than court, you can't work that out.
The whole thing leaves me scratching my head, because when I look at what, we seem to have our hands tied, and yet we come to these kinds of meetings hoping that there'll be some reasonable discourse and some dialogue that would make sense and serve the real needs of what's going on, as opposed to, I've heard a lot of law quoted and a lot of we can't do this or we can't do that, but when we're trying to solve problems, and it just seems to me that we've got to come with a slightly more open mind and listen.
Well, true. The one thing though is that Andy said it is, I don't necessarily like that petition warrant, because you can argue it's personal, although it isn't. The voters will get to decide this issue. So I know it's frustrating, And I know the cemetery trustees are doing fiduciarily what they think they need to do. Can't fault them on that, they're volunteers, they don't get paid for this. But the petition article, the one thing it does is it lets the voters decide the issue. So you can't ask for more than that as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, the issue will be decided March 7th, is that the election? One way or another. I mean, either, well, I shouldn't say that. Who manages the land will be decided March 7th, whether it continues to be the trustees or it becomes the selectmen. At that point, hopefully the selectmen would view, if the warrant article passes and it needs to pass by a simple majority, hopefully the selectmen would view that as a referendum on the use of the land and would work towards a solution that would allow them to purchase a portion of the land, not all of the land, but the portion, 8 to 10 acres that Dwight referenced, so that fields could be preserved, and then the rest can be developed to a cemetery as time comes down, as time dictates or need dictates. So, again, the key is get out to the polls, get your friends to the polls. If you feel strongly about this, vote. I'll be taking attendance.
Better off showing up March 11th.
Is that the date? March 11th.
You can really jump on.
I have a question here. So, I know this has come up in some rec commission meetings, but I'm never clear on the exact answer. Where the deadline is September 1st and we can't have any recreation taking place there is infrastructure in place in terms of irrigation capabilities and things like that. So does all of the equipment that's out there need to be moved prior to that September 1st date?
Yeah,
And does moving that out, would it correspondingly affect any of the summer programming that the rec department does?
I mean, I don't know timing. I know that we have to leave on September 1st the land the way we found it. So I would think the minimum is the playground, the backstop, benches has to be removed. I think the irrigation is still up for debate. Theoretically, legally, I would say we would have to remove it if demanded, but it may be a benefit to the land that would stay away. I don't think it's been worked out.
Right, so in reality, from a recreation perspective, those fields are actually not usable quite a bit before then because we're obligated to remove the infrastructure.
I mean, it's only the backstop for the softball maybe, but the flat field, I you would think you could use up to the date.
Do we have to put the giant boulder back that showed up on the day they would start work on the fields, or?
I don't think so.
Hi, could somebody speak to what you meant by when you said in the spring of 2015 it will be a challenge to find rec fields? Because you caught yourself, you started to say a crisis and then you changed it to challenge, so I appreciate your honesty there. Because I really don't have a handle on the exact needs that we're trying to solve here. And I don't want to hear about private clubs using the fields, because as taxpayers, that's not our worry. We're worried about the poor children of Amherst that certainly need places to play. And I'm asking for a couple of reasons, because number one, it was already said, I think Brad, you said it, the selectmen say they're going to challenge, they'll go to court and they'll challenge the cemetery trustees if they go and look for and ask to use that money. And then, the taxpayers will be paying two sides, to fight that battle. So I want to make sure that if we're going to go that route, and we're going to be paying, the money to do that, I want to be clear about what the need is, what's the outcome, in terms of, what we're saving for the town, in terms of, children using the field. And the other piece that goes along with it is, I think you brought up, sir, that, already the town has said no twice when you asked for money to buy rec fields. So the general public isn't seeing this dire need, to go out and purchase more fields. And so I think that just some clarity on what the need is going to be in the spring of 2015 in terms of the recreation use and the school use, if the schools are using that. If you could, I think it'd be helpful for people to understand that.
What I meant was that in the fall of 14, there are, the main use of cemetery fields is for flat fields. and primarily it is soccer. And it doesn't have a competitor in terms of flat field use. Soccer is throughout the whole community on most of our flat fields.